It was August 9th, 1965. This was Lee Kuan Yew. He had just learned that Singapore, his territory, had been expelled from Malaysia. Now he had to announce this news to his people live on national television. But he couldn't continue. His voice choked. He stopped. He broke down in tears. Why did this happen? Because Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia with its predominantly Malay Muslim population, feared Singapore. Feared it because it was an island with a majority Chinese population. Feared that one day, Singapore's port would outshine their own. So Malaysia expelled Singapore for personal reasons. For Mr. Lee, this was a disaster. Half of Singapore's water came from Malaysia. 90% of its food was imported across the strait. Without Malaysia, Singapore was doomed. A land without agriculture, without oil, without minerals, without industry. At that time, Singapore was just a crowded port full of slums. 75% of families lived in shacks or slums without toilets or clean water. Families cooked with charcoal, shared dirty water pipes, and lined up for public toilets. More than half the population was illiterate. Ethnic riots between Malays and Chinese erupted in the streets, leaving corpses in the sewers. This was the country Lee had to lead, a country that didn't look like a nation, but more like a failing nation on the verge of collapse. However, he didn't know that. These tears were not the end. They were the beginning of one of the greatest turnarounds in history, because the man who cried on television that day refused to surrender. From this insignificant port, Lee Kuan Yew began fighting corruption, lifting the poor out of the slums into housing, and opening the island to foreign investment. He designed an administrative system so extremely strict that spitting on the ground or chewing gum could land a citizen in jail. With iron discipline and uncompromising order, he would build one of the richest nations in the world, so rich and well-governed that it became a model for nation building. He built a city richer not only than Kuala Lumpur, but even more so than Malaysia, cleaner than London, safer than New York. At his peak, Lee Kuan Yew was immensely respected and also incredibly feared by the world, to the point that he dared to fine the United States for spying on him, and the US paid. He even called Australia the white scum of Asia for its dependence on raw material exports, and Australia listened. Because on that day, Lee realized one thing: Singapore might not have resources, but its people were the resource. For 6 weeks following his nationally televised speech, he disappeared. He locked himself in a Changi apartment, unable to eat, unable to sleep. Doctors had to prescribe tranquilizers. Parliament was in a state of limbo, unsure of what to do. But even in despair, he wrote to British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, "Don't worry about Singapore. My colleagues and I remain sane. We remain rational even in moments of despair. We will weigh all consequences before acting." After 6 weeks of recovery, this was the political chessboard Lee faced. A small port with no army, no food, no natural resources, surrounded by larger and potentially hostile nations. Diplomacy was paramount. The world had to recognize Singapore before it vanished. Within a month, Lee brought his country into the United Nations and was accepted, but the area surrounding Singapore was fraught with risk. In March 1965, 2 Indonesian Marines bombed the McDonald's building in Singapore, killing 3 civilians and injuring 33. The attack was part of President Sukarno's violent confrontasi campaign against the newly formed Federation of Malaysia, of which Singapore had briefly been a part. Singapore apprehended the attackers, tried them, and sentenced them to death. In Singapore, they were terrorists, but in Indonesia, they were soldiers following orders, heroes. The execution sparked outrage in Jakarta, where students stormed the Singaporean embassy. Therefore, to maintain stable relations with Indonesia, Lee personally went to Jakarta. At the graves of the 2 soldiers, he bowed and laid flowers. Not to apologize. It was humiliating but necessary. Singapore needed Indonesia as a partner, not an enemy. By 1967, Lee co-founded ASEAN with Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Singapore was no longer alone, but cooperated with its neighbors. Militarily, the island lacked its own forces. The British had withdrawn. Indonesia and Malaysia could become enemies once again. Therefore, in 1967, Lee established compulsory military service. Every young man had to serve. For training, he secretly sought out Israel, a small nation like his own, which he admired for defeating larger neighbors with a small but disciplined army. Israeli advisors developed military doctrine for Singapore. By 1971, there were 16,000 troops ready. Lee's principal principle was clear: if you cannot defend yourself, no one else will. Now that Singapore had gained international recognition, established relations with its neighbors, and could defend itself, Lee shifted his focus inward. The greatest threat was not just poverty, but also ethnicity. Chinese, Malays, and Indians frequently clashed violently. Lee declared all races equal, but the state would set boundaries. He established 4 official languages: Chinese, Malay, Tamil, and English. Each child could learn their mother tongue, but at the same time had to learn English, the common language to unite them all. Religion was also tightly controlled. Any attempt to spread a divisive faith was forbidden. However, the economy was still collapsing. To remedy this, Lee turned to the Dutch economist Albert Winsemius. His advice was clear: forget ideology, forget nationalism. If you want Singapore to succeed, make it attractive to foreign companies. Keep taxes low, fight corruption, and ensure stability. Clean up the island from top to bottom. No litter, no riots, no slums. Build factories, train the workforce. If you do that, multinational corporations will come. Lee listened. As foreign capital poured in, factories flourished. Large American and Japanese corporations such as Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, and General Electric appeared one after another. The shipyards left behind by the British were repurposed. Lee invested resources to build Singapore Airlines and Neptune Orient Lines. The education system was immediately adjusted to train engineers, technicians, and workers who could serve these companies. And with the profits from these investments, Lee transformed the daily lives of the people. 3/4 of the population still lived in slums, so he strengthened the role of the Housing Development Board, HDB. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people were moved into concrete apartments with electricity and clean water, giving each family a share of the nation. To finance this, workers were forced to contribute about 20% of their salary to the Central Savings Fund, CPF. In theory, this was savings for retirement, but in reality, it became a huge source of capital for the nation, used to build housing, infrastructure, and investments. However, there was one crucial point: this money was never used for social welfare. There was no support. Every citizen had to fend for themselves. To ensure the system operated efficiently, Lee drastically increased the salaries of ministers and civil servants to guarantee honesty, and established the Anti-Corruption Investigation Bureau. Anyone who accepted bribes was arrested and severely punished. When his Minister of National Development, Tay Chang-wan, was found to have accepted a $1 million bribe from 2 private companies, the agency immediately launched an investigation. Before his trial, he took poison and committed suicide. Lee's reaction was cold. He was wrong. He accepted bribes. I couldn't save him. No one is above the law. Not even a loyal minister can be removed, because if there is one exception, there will be countless others. Finally, Lee launched the City in a Garden campaign. He ordered trees to be planted along the streets, rivers to be cleaned of sewage, and parks to be built in the city. Cleanliness and greenery became the promotional image, a signal to the world that Singapore was no longer a slum. By the early 1970s, in just a few years, Singapore had a national flag, an army, an economy, and a media system that conveyed a single message: Singapore was rising. During the 1970s, Lee shifted his focus to expansion. Factories alone were not enough. He built Changi Airport, which opened in 1981 and immediately became one of the best airports in the world. The Port of Singapore developed into one of the busiest ports on the planet, becoming a transit hub between Asia and the West. Singapore Airlines, launched in 1972, became a global symbol of quality and efficiency. A flow of goods, finance, and technology poured into Singapore, not just for expansion, but for access to the entire ASEAN region. But growth is not enough without order. Chewing gum? Banned. Drug trafficking? Death penalty. Littering, spitting, crossing the road illegally? Fines of thousands of dollars. Opposition? Bankruptcy by lawsuits or detention without trial. The press? Tightly controlled. Lee's philosophy was clear: we decide what is right. It doesn't matter what others think. His foreign policy was equally tough. In the 1970s, the CIA tried to infiltrate Singapore's intelligence agency. Lee exposed them publicly, humiliating Washington and fining the United States $100 million, and the US paid. He called Australia the white garbage of Asia for its reliance on raw resources. He called India an incomplete nation, and he warned Africa, corruption will destroy you. Meanwhile, he balanced East and West. Singapore allowed American warships to dock, but also opened its doors to China. When Deng Xiaoping launched reforms in 1978, he looked to Singapore as a model to learn from. The world's most populous nation was learning from one of the smallest. Within Singapore, Lee redesigned society. Housing blocks were allocated according to ethnic ratios to force Chinese, Malays, and Indians to live together. English became the common language. The Stop at 2 campaign encouraged families to have no more than 2 children, until Lee realized this was causing a rapid aging of the population. Long-haired men were banned from working in the public sector. Women were encouraged to go to school and work. He even suggested that only intelligent women should have children, while the poor should be sterilized. Lee didn't just set policies, he shaped the people of Singapore. But that toughness wasn't accidental. He grew up with a gambling father who squandered the family fortune. His mother was the one who kept the family together. In 1942, he witnessed the British Empire collapse in just 70 days in Singapore before the Japanese army. That shock stayed with him for life. In 70 days, the British Empire fell. From then on, I decided never to let Singapore be controlled by anyone again. During the Japanese occupation, he nearly died in the Suk Ching massacre, when tens of thousands of Chinese men were captured and executed. He survived only by luck. To survive, he learned Japanese in addition to English, Malay, and Chinese. He sold glue during the war before becoming a top student. Those experiences taught him one thing: never depend on anyone, and never believe in luck. Everyone must fend for themselves. And the results proved it. By 2000, Singapore's GDP per capita reached 24,000 US dollars, on par with Canada and France. By 2025, this figure is projected to reach 90,000 US dollars per person, higher than the United States and far surpassing Malaysia and Indonesia. In education, Singapore tops PISA tests, outperforming Finland, Japan, and South Korea. A resource-poor nation has become a financial and intellectual hub. But the price paid was freedom, and Lee was frank about it. I was often accused of interfering in people's private lives. That's true. If I hadn't done that, we wouldn't be where we are today. In his later years, he walked through the green city he created. Time took its toll. By the 2000s, his health had deteriorated, and in March 2015, he passed away at the age of 91. At his funeral, nearly 2 million Singaporeans stood in the rain to bid farewell to the leader who had brought them hope. And that was Lee Kuan Yew, the man who created Singapore. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.